This tutorial is going to cover creating a cardboard box with creased edges and an opening. I'm starting out with a polygon cube, and once I've got the shape that I want, I'm going to bevel the edges so that it looks like creased cardboard. I'm going to right click and choose edge, and then I'll marquee all of the edges. I'm going to hold down the space bar and go to edit mesh, and I'm going to go to bevel, and I'm going to go to the attributes. All the attributes that you can reach can be done so by clicking on the white box at the far end of the menu. And in here, the width would be the distance, and the segments are the lines that would appear on either side of the original edges to give us that creased look. Now for this, I've set it at 0.04 for the width and the segments of 2. And you can see now we've got something that is starting to resemble perhaps a box of creased cardboard. I'm going to return to my object mode. Now, the box on the left here is open. I wouldn't do that until I finish my texture mapping, because inside of Maya, when our surfaces are horizontal and vertical, it's much easier to get the texture maps to sit the way we would like. So the next step would be simply to add a texture to our geometry. I'm going to right click, choose assign new material. I'll click on Arnold and then Arnold surface. Now I'm going to apply the default checkerboard that appears inside of Maya to make sure that I get the textures oriented in ways that there won't be any distortion when I create my texture map in Photoshop. I'll click at the end of the color tab, I'll click on the checkerboard, and then I'll select my geometry, and if you don't see the checkerboard, immediately hit 6 on the keyboard. Now there are two things I want to do before I add the UV mapping automatic. I want to delete by type history, so I'm going to click on that. And then I want to go to modify and freeze transforms. And that will assure me that the shape of my faces will be accurate inside the UV texture editor once I've used automatic mapping. So with my geometry selected in the object mode, I'm going to hold down the space bar, I'll go to UVs, and I'll choose automatic. And you'll see the checkerboard pattern appears on your geometry with the boxes all pretty much evenly distributed and perfectly square black and white. I'll deselect, go back to my object mode, and then I'm going to add the UV texture editor to my shelf. Now to add an element to my shelf, I would hold down the Command Shift, go to the top of the user interface to UV, and then at the very top is UV Editor. And when I click on that, I'm going to see that my UV map appears inside the checkerboard pattern in the UV editor. I'm going to turn off the checkerboard by clicking on the little icon, little green button with the mountains, and now I can see my geometry. Now that I have my UV map, I need to sew these pieces together so that when I bring it to Photoshop, I can add the textures in the appropriate faces. I'm going to go to View inside the UV editor, and I'm going to choose Shaded. And then I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to choose Edge. And as I roll over an edge, I can see the corresponding edge it needs to snap to. Now that I have the edges selected that I want to sew together, I'm going to go to Cut, Sew, and I'm going to choose Move and Sew. And when I zoom back on my window, I can now right-click, choose UV Shell, and these two behave as one. Now often enough you'll need to move these out of that box where they were first generated, because very often they start to overlap when you start to sew. I'm going to right-click and choose Edge once again, and I'll select this. I'm going to hit A on the keyboard so you can see this function. And then I'm going to go to Cut and Sew, Move and Sew. And I'll go to the next edge. And I can either go to Cut, Move and Sew, or I can hit G to repeat the previous function. and that works with any functions inside of Maya. You can use one tool consecutively by using the G key. Now that I've got the UV map sewn together, I'm going to put it back in the corner where the checkerboard appears. So I'll turn that on for a minute inside the UV editor. I'll right click and choose UV shell, select the shell, hit W on the keyboard, and I'll put that over the checkerboard, scaling it down just a bit inside the parameters. And I'm leaving a little bit of extra room because I want to have the little flap that appears on the lid. And I'm going to make that now as I open the box up. So I'm going to go to my object mode for my geometry, and I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard to hide the checkerboard pattern. It just makes it a little bit easier. With my box selected, I'm going to right click and choose face. I'm going to select the top face. Now I want to select the first row of the bevel edge as well. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and if I hit the close bracket for HTML, which appears to the left of the question mark, it selects the next row of polygon faces. So I'm going to zoom in and hit 4, and you can see now that those polygons are selected. Now I'm going to hold down the space bar. I'm going to go to Edit Mesh, and I'm going to choose Extract. And you'll see that the area we've just worked on now has a green outline. And I'm going to go to my object mode and click off and reselect. And now I can see that that edge has been separated out from the rest of my box. Now I want to rotate this so it seems to be still attached to the box on this edge. So I'm going to center the pivot, and then I'm going to hit W. And I'm going to go to my orthographic, in this case the front view, because what I want to do now is I want to move that pivot to this edge. Now if you recall, the letter D will allow us to drag the pivot to the point we'd like it to be at. But if I want it to be precise, I could hold down the D and the V, and you'll feel it snap. Now I'm going to go to my perspective view, and I'm going to tip this to see if it does open the way I want. So once I've got the pivot where I'd like it to be, I'll hit E on the keyboard, and now I'll open the box up. Now I have one last element I want to add, and that's that little flap that would keep the lid inside the box. In order to add the flap now, I'm going to hold down the Command Shift, and I'm going to go to Edit Mesh, and I want to use the Extrude tool. I'm going to click on the Extrude tool, and when I zoom in, I can see the different features of this tool. Now I'm going to click on the little blue ball or the circle that appears off to the right of the actual tool itself, and now I can drag out the surface I want and tip it down. And usually a box lid like this is tapered at the very bottom, so I'll scale it in to taper it like so, and I'll go ahead and save that. I'm now going to right click, and I'm going to choose the face that comprises the flap, and I'll hit W on the keyboard, and I'm going to use Planar Mapping. And I'm doing that so that if in the event I want to put text or a design that it is specifically proportioned and has to be properly placed, I'll be able to do that. I'm holding down the space bar, and I'm going to go to UV Planar Mapping, and I'm going to go to the attributes. In the attributes, I'm going to pick the y-axis because that's closest to the surface that it'll introduce the UV map onto, and I'm going to hit apply. Now, the first thing I'll do is I'll rotate this. So if I look at the red T that appears in the corner of the planar mapping coordinates, I can click on that, and it gives me all the other tools. So I'm going to click on the circle to activate the circle axes. I'll hit 6 on the keyboard, and I'm just going to rotate this down so it's in the same angle as the geometry. If I wanted to, I'd go to my orthographic view here, and I'll hit F, and I'll just tip it a little bit more. Now the distance from the surface has no bearing on it really, So that is something that's insignificant. Now the next thing I need to do is go to my channels box. And in my channels box, I want both the projection width and height to be the same number. So I'll click in there and I'll make them both 1. I'm going to return my perspective view, and now I can see that that checkerboard pattern fits pretty good on that. The boxes are pretty square. But it's going to be quite large when I go to the UV editor. So I'm going to click on the UV editor now, and you can see the proportions of that the way it is now. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose object mode. And I'm going to select all my elements of geometry. Now, I don't need the checkerboard, so I'm going to turn that off for a moment. And if I shift select the elements that comprise this UV map, I can see them all together on my editor. I'm going to right click and choose shell, and I'm going to select the shell I just generated for the lid. And all I'm going to do now is rotate it in its proper angle, and I'll scale it, and I'll start to put it into position. I'm going to hit F on the keyboard so I can get on top of this, and I'll continue to scale this so that it fits in that area. I'll hit F again, and I'll get my scale tool, tweak it a bit more, and I'll put that right like so. I'll right click and go to edge, and if I roll over my edges now, I can see where the edges need to join. So I'll select one of these two edges and I'll click on move and sew, or go to cut and sew and choose move and sew. Now you'll notice that there's an actual dock inside the UV editor, and to get to that you would go up inside the UV editor, and if you were to go to view, you'll see custom shelf, and that will show you this area. And then if you were to hold command shift, just like in our dock here, I could go to cut and sew and click on that move and sew tool, and it puts it on the shelf for me. And now I've joined the two together. I'm going to save them. I'll hit A on the keyboard, and I'm going to turn my checkerboard on. And now it's a matter of going to the object mode for my geometry and shift selecting all the components. Now that they're all shifted in their right quadrant, I could now go to image, UV snapshot. I'd browse to my project, box skin, and make sure the image format's a ping, and then the size that I would like to have for this. We're using a standard 2048 by 2048. I'll hit apply and close.